Welcome to Assessment Literacy 201. The goals of this training are to review academic rigor and depth of knowledge, to introduce you to Karen Hess's flipbook Webb's depth of knowledge, and to provide you with tools to create assessment questions that are more closely aligned to the rigor that is expected through Common Core state standards, and to better prepare students for next generation assessments as well. The slides from this presentation came from the Center for College and Career Readiness. We are not using every slide. We have pared it down so that they're more applicable to what we are doing here at TDA. And of course, the main point of reviewing depth of knowledge and rigor is to prepare you to lead Common Core implementation in your individual classes and with your students. What we know about Common Core implementation and depth of knowledge and rigor is that all of these really are a process that is not a one-shot deal. You don't just go to one training and magically insert everything into the curriculum that needs to be there. It's a multi-year process. And what we are doing right now is identifying one of the priorities of implementation. And the priority is the assessments that we develop for student use. So by putting together this presentation and by purchasing copies of Webb's Depth of Knowledge flipbook, we are trying to offer some job-embedded support. So what does this look like? Well, the vision is that through your curriculum revision, you will be able to include assessment questions that are not just using one depth of knowledge. You are able to choose the depth of knowledge that is most appropriate for the material covered, for the assignment, for the step of the process you're addressing, and even your students. So, the first question, rigor is, and this comes from Barbara Blackburn, as you can see, it's creating an environment in which each student is expected to learn at high levels, they're supported so they can learn at those high levels, and they demonstrate their learning at high levels. Academic rigor is accomplished by increasing the complexity of thinking, and it's not just in our assessments, but it's also in our content, in our instruction, and our assessment. So when we think about course content, we want to think about the progression we need to lead students through to develop that understanding that we're trying to teach. And of course, we have to consider appropriate leveled text for the challenge. We cannot just hand a student material that is the same for everyone. We need to meet the student where they are to try to build their skills to get to the point where they're all able to use the same material. When you're talking about instruction, we really want you to consider critical thinking, trying to help the student understand what it means to build relevance. That could be background knowledge that they already have. It could be background knowledge that you have to instruct them in. But you really do have to help them see why these different elements are relevant. And of course, the ability to integrate ideas is always important. And when we think about assessment, is it aligned to the instructional target? Can you break down a content standard and say, okay, so here's the content standard, this is what they have to do at the end, but what are all the skills I have to build and assess to make sure they're actually getting to what that content standard covers? So you're looking at how do you build student achievement through all of these steps to get to that final understanding. So when we talk about Webb's depth of knowledge, Webb's depth of knowledge is a process and criteria for systematically analyzing cognitive expectation demanded by standards, curricular activities, and assessment tasks. So it's not just one thing, it's all of these different things. But it's also based on the assumption that curricular elements may all be categorized based on cognitive demands required to produce an acceptable response. So we all have to agree that we really can categorize what we are asking students to do so that we can determine what is acceptable. So you're always going to have that end result in mind. What is it that you expect students to be able to provide in order to demonstrate their understanding? So it's almost like the teacher has to actually create their exemplar final project so that they can make sure that through their assessment they are hitting all of the different elements within there when they're creating their rubric or when they are delivering instruction to students or even providing examples to students. The thing to know about depth of knowledge is that it is not just about the verb. We've all seen those Bloom taxonomy sheets that are just verb after verb after verb. But depth of knowledge is not only determined by the verb. It is really determined by the context in which you use the verb and the depth of thinking that you are requiring of your students. So here is a little breakdown about depth of knowledge and different ways to think about it. So depth of knowledge 1 is recall and reproduction. You're just showing that you know the facts. Depth of knowledge 2, can you use the skill? Depth of knowledge 3, choose when to use the skill. So there's some type of student decision-making process that is more apparent in depth of knowledge 3 than it is in depth of knowledge 2. And then of course depth of knowledge 4 is when you're able to apply the skill in a new area. Can a student demonstrate they understand it by extending it to another problem or another activity? So the verbs are usually what we kind of jump to first, and a lot of that does come from Bloom's taxonomy training that we've had in the past, where the level of understanding you were assessing was based on the verb you used in your lesson plans or in your directions. But what you really have to start doing to better get at depth of knowledge is to consider the context in which you're using the verb. So explain to me where you live does not raise depth of knowledge of a simple response. So even if the student has to use addresses or landmarks, they are doing absolutely nothing more than recalling and reciting. That's it. Depth of knowledge 1. So depth of knowledge is about what follows the verb. So here's an example. Analyze this sentence to decide if the commas have been used correctly. Well, sounds challenging, but it's really not that high cognitive processing. All you have to know is the comma rules. So then all you're doing is saying, yes, I know the comma rules, yes, they're right. You're recalling information. So let's take a look at the same verb used 3 different ways to get at 3 different depth of knowledge levels. Describe 3 characteristics of metamorphic rocks. Okay, simply recalling. To bump it up to level 2, describe the difference between metamorphic and igneous. Okay, so now we're really thinking about 2 different things, compare and contrast. Depth of knowledge 3, describe a model you might use to represent relationships that exist within the rock cycle. You can really see the difference using the same verb because you're looking at what comes after it. Are you simply asking them to recall information, or are you challenging them to use what they know to demonstrate understanding? So depth of knowledge is about intended income, not difficulty. I'm sorry that's cut off a little bit. So depth of knowledge is the reference to the complexity of mental processing. So adding is a mental process. Knowing the rule for adding is the intended outcome. Once someone learns the rule of how to add, it's depth of knowledge 1. So, adding 4,678,895 plus 9,578,885 is still depth of knowledge 1. It doesn't matter that it's difficult. It doesn't matter that there's lots of carrying. All you are asking students to do is demonstrate that they know the rule of how to add and how to carry numbers. It's difficult, but it's not complex. And that's where we need to start thinking in terms of the assessments or the material we deliver. What is the complexity of what we're asking? So depth of knowledge is about complexity. So what we really have to make sure of in our material that we are using with students is that our intended student learning outcome is really what helps us demonstrate the depth of knowledge level. So really what we need to do to ensure that we are increasing the rigor of our courses is to really begin with the end in mind. And this doesn't matter if you're thinking about your entire course, whether you're thinking about a unit, or whether you're thinking about a lesson. What you need to determine is what outcome are you assessing? What does it look like? And the it could be, what does the student know and what are they able to do at the end to demonstrate that they know the material? And then what is your vision? What do you want to see students do at the end? You have to have that vision in mind when you are creating your material, whether it's an assessment or an instructional video or how you're going to frame your feedback. You always have to have that in mind. So here's a couple of examples that look at different depths of knowledge. So here's a student role. The student solves routine problems and tasks involving multiple decision points and concepts. They construct models to show relationships, demonstrate use of conceptual knowledge. They can compile and organize, illustrate and explain with examples or models. So why is this depth of knowledge 2? When we look at the red underlined words, we have the word routine, multiple decision points and concepts, conceptual. Think about what this means in terms of complexity. The word routine is kind of a hint that it really may not be very complex because it is routine. It is something they've been exposed to. Multiple decision points and concepts is what increases the complexity from a level 1. But right now we're really just kind of looking at a depth of knowledge 2. So what would a depth of knowledge 3 look like? With depth of knowledge 3, the student uncovers and selects relevant and credible supporting evidence for analysis, critiques, debates, claims, judgments. They can plan, initiate questions, dispute, argue, test idea or solutions. They can sustain inquiry into topics or deeper problems. They can apply it to the real world. So you can see when we compare that back to depth of knowledge 2, the level of complexity has been increased because now we're asking the student to uncover and select what they feel is relevant and credible. There could be more than one right answer here. So when you think about depth of knowledge 3, one of the elements that definitely pushes that complexity is the fact that there's more than one right answer. You are asking the student to select the evidence and prove to you through their presentation, whether it's written or vocal, why did they choose that? Why did they select that evidence? How did they uncover it? How did they select it? So you're really kind of getting at more complexity through what you're asking students to do. So when we look at this question, what is it that makes this question complex? In describing the women's suffrage movement, the author uses words such as battle, militant, and showdown. Do you think this is an effective way to describe the women's suffrage movement? Support your answer with 2 references to the article. Now, this is asking them to go back to a primary source document and find evidence. But what is it about this question that makes it complex? And yes, that was a little bit of wait time to let you think. So, what about the word effective? The thing about the word effective is that it is non-routine. It's asking students to determine what they feel effective really means in the question. We are asking for their opinion, and then we're asking them to support their opinion. So the way you word questions can really help lead students through the path of increasing their depth of knowledge, which of course increases rigor. So now it's time to go ahead and check out the flipbook that was purchased from the Center for College and Career Readiness. And again, this is a guide for using Webb's Depth of Knowledge by Karen Hess. What I want you to notice is they have it broken down not only by English language arts, but they've also included history, social studies, math, and science. So if you were to open your book to pages 8 and 9, you would be looking at Depth of Knowledge 1. Page 8 is the breakdown for English language arts, history, social studies. You've got Bloom's taxonomy on the left side, and then you've got Webb's Depth of Knowledge 1 on the right side. A couple different things to notice are that revised Bloom's taxonomy, look at the evaluate row. In Depth of Knowledge level 1, there really is no evaluation. So you have to kind of remember that this is not just a row by row comparison. Depth of knowledge is different from Bloom's taxonomy. So as you're looking through your flipbook, you really want to make sure you are paying attention to how these different things are different. And if you flip back to pages 6 and 7, that is where they really go into detail explaining what does level 1 really mean. Now they do give you verbs, and even though we're supposed to kind of not pay as much attention to the verb, we're supposed to pay attention to what comes after the verb, you do still kind of need some verbs to frame it in your mind. But then they also provide a teacher role and a student role. So they're really looking at it from beginning to end. What should the teacher be doing? What should the student be doing? Then they also give you a list of possible products that a student could create to demonstrate their knowledge at that depth of knowledge level. And not only do they give you products, but they also give you potential activities. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what do you feel is acceptable evidence of student mastery? How will you know if the students have learned what you wanted them to learn, and have they achieved the desired results? What will you accept as evidence of student understanding and proficiency? Now again, the flipbook does give you possible products and potential activities and even potential questions that you could use to assess student learning. What you have to determine is, what is the true point of what you are doing with students? What do you want them to know and be able to do at the end? So you really need to think about performance tasks, not tests. Smaller tasks will build to bigger tasks. So you really need to think about, how do you scaffold what you're asking students to do to lead them through all the steps to get to that final product. Now here's a couple descriptors of what are considered rigorous assessments. When you give a real purpose and even a real audience, one example of that is when you give students a project and you tell them that they are designing this for students younger than them. So if you're doing something in an 11th grade class, one of your possible prompts could be, imagine you have to explain this to a room of 4th graders. What language would you have to use so that a 4th grader would understand? And you can even ask them to think about what images would be more appropriate for 4th grade than maybe your own grade. So really think about how you can use audience within your prompts. Another thing that typically goes along with a rigorous assessment is that there really is no clear right answer. You are asking students to form an opinion and pull the evidence from the primary source document that shows what they used to help them develop that opinion. And of course, you should have a clear picture of what success looks like. You really should think about what an exemplar project would look like for that final assessment. It might mean that you create it yourself, but you still have to have that end result in mind. So when you think about evidence, don't just think about that end of unit test or that end of unit project. Think about all the different things you can do that would scaffold student understanding throughout the entire process, and how you can gather that evidence and use that evidence. And then we have a couple other things to consider about good assessment questions. Think about writing questions that are open-ended, where, again, there's really not a right or wrong answer. You're looking for the student to prove to you that they have used some type of primary source material to form an opinion. What is it that they just read that makes them feel that way or think that? So when a student truly understands something, we know they can explain it, they can interpret it, they can apply it to something else, they can even emphasize with it or with the outcome of it, they have perspective, they have self-knowledge. So what you really need to do is take your flipbook, take all of the experience you've gathered, all the evidence you have, and really think about how you can take all of this and implement it in your next curricular revision. What are the overall learning goals for the lesson, for the unit, for the semester, or even for the year? Make sure you really know what your objectives are, and can you connect that to the standards? Do you have sample performance tasks ready to go so that you can say to a student, I need you to be able to do something like this? Do you have rubrics ready to show students what that expected level of understanding means? And of course, do your students understand how to change what they're doing to move up in the rubric? So maybe they earn a 2. Do they understand what it means to earn that 4? Can they really see within their own work what that means? So not only are you designing your rubric to help yourself with assessment, you're also designing that rubric to help with your instruction.